I never thought I would be alone in my own family. I whispered to myself as I stepped out of the funeral home into the chilly Illinois afternoon, the air heavy with the scent of wet grass and fallen leaves. Margaret Sullivan, 69, widow, white, stood quietly beside the gravestone of Richard, my late husband, feeling the weight of years and love lost pressing against her chest. The guests had all left, and the silence around me was both comforting and terrifying. Michael, my 42-year-old son, had hugged me tightly just moments ago, whispering promises that everything would be all right and that we would be together as a family. Yet even as he said it, I sensed an unspoken distance forming, a gap that no words could bridge. Jennifer, my 39-year-old daughter-in-law, smiled politely and offered condolences, but her eyes were calculating, scanning the environment for details I could not yet name. Emily, my 16-year-old granddaughter, clutched her mother's hand and avoided my gaze, glancing up at me only briefly, her expression a mix of confusion and curiosity. As I walked back into the quiet house that evening, I expected comfort, warmth, the presence of family who would check on me, call me, and sit together to share stories of my late husband. Instead, the rooms echoed with emptiness, the ticking of the clock louder than any voice, reminding me of how quickly life can shift from connection to isolation. I prepared tea in the kitchen, each movement deliberate, savoring the small rituals of daily life that now belonged solely to me, aware that my family's attentiveness would not be as constant as I had believed. The phone on the counter remained silent, and even the familiar chime of the front doorbell brought only a fleeting hope that someone would come, someone would notice, someone would bridge the sudden emotional distance that had grown overnight. I moved to the living room, arranging photographs of Richard and our family on the mantelpiece, examining each smile frozen in time, realizing that these images were all that reminded me of unity that no longer felt present. I felt a quiet surge of determination, understanding that my awareness and patience would guide the next steps, that observing, waiting, and noticing the subtle shifts in body language, voice inflection, and casual comments would reveal more than confrontation ever could. Each memory, each glance, each paused step in the hallway became data, a silent catalog of human behavior, allowing me to comprehend the underlying motives without suspicion being raised. I settled into my armchair, journal at hand, pen poised, ready to document the patterns, the gestures, the moments of omission that would expose the gradual distancing of my family. The evening wore on, sunlight fading through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors, and with it came the realization that the journey ahead would not be dictated by their choices, but by my observant response, my calm authority, and the deliberate pacing of engagement with those who claimed to love me. In that quiet, solitary moment, I understood that strength was not loud, it was meticulous, it was patient, and it would be mine alone to wield as the days unfolded. The first week after Richard's funeral passed more quietly than I expected. At first, I told myself that everyone was grieving in their own way. Michael had work. Jennifer had responsibilities. Emily had school. Life continued moving forward for them, and I tried to be understanding. Every morning, I woke up in the same bed Richard and I had shared for 43 years. Every morning, for a few brief seconds, I forgot he was gone. Then reality returned. The empty space beside me. The silence. The absence of his familiar voice asking if I wanted coffee. I kept my routine because routines felt safe. I watered the flowers. I checked the mail. I walked 2 miles around the neighborhood every afternoon. The neighbors waved. Some stopped to talk. Strangers seemed more interested in my well-being than my own family. During the first few days, Michael called every evening. The conversations were short but comforting. He would ask if I needed anything and remind me to call if I felt lonely. I appreciated it. Then the calls became every other day, then every 3 days. By the second week, I found myself staring at my phone more often than I wanted to admit. One Tuesday evening, I prepared enough spaghetti for 4 people out of habit. I stood in the kitchen looking at the extra plates before quietly putting them back into the cabinet. Old habits die slowly. Loneliness arrives all at once. A few days later, I noticed photographs on social media that caught me by surprise. Emily had posted pictures from a family dinner at Michael's house. Everyone was smiling around the dining table. Jennifer's parents were there. Several cousins were there. Even neighbors appeared in the photographs. I looked carefully through every image. I was not in a single one. At first, I assumed it had been planned at the last minute. Then I saw the date. The dinner had taken place 3 days earlier. No one had mentioned it. No one had called. No one had invited me. I sat quietly in my living room holding the phone in my hand. The disappointment was not dramatic. It was small, sharp, precise, like a paper cut that continues stinging long after it happens. I told myself not to overreact. Families get busy. People forget things. Reasonable explanations are easy to find when you want to protect your heart. The following Sunday, I called Michael. He answered on the third ring. His voice sounded distracted. We talked for a few minutes about the weather and Emily's school activities. Then I casually mentioned the dinner. There was a brief pause. Just a second. But I noticed it. "Oh, that," he said. "It was nothing special." Nothing special. The phrase stayed with me long after the conversation ended. For 43 years, Richard and I had built a family around birthdays, cookouts, Sunday dinners, and holidays. We believed gathering together mattered. Suddenly, gatherings were happening without me. That evening, I sat on the back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. The neighborhood was peaceful. Children rode bicycles down the street. Somewhere nearby, someone was grilling hamburgers. Ordinary life continued exactly as it always had. Yet something felt different now. Not because of Richard's absence. I was beginning to understand that grief was not the only thing creating distance. Little by little, call by call, dinner by dinner, an invisible wall seemed to be rising between me and the people I thought would pull me closer when I needed them most. It was a Friday afternoon when I stumbled across the first unmistakable sign that things were changing in ways I had not anticipated. I was scrolling through Emily's social media feed, expecting the usual harmless posts about school projects and weekend plans, when I saw it. A group photograph of my son Michael, his wife Jennifer, and a small gathering of our extended family, all smiling around a beautifully set dining table. There I was not included. The realization hit me quietly but sharply, a pulse of hurt threading through the otherwise ordinary day. I studied the picture carefully, noting who was there, who had been invited, and the subtle smiles that suggested comfort and camaraderie, yet without me. I could see that Emily had posted it innocently, without realizing the exclusion, but it still spoke volumes. I set my phone down and took a deep breath, feeling the quiet ache of being left out of something that had once been the center of our family life. That evening, I prepared dinner for myself, a simple roast chicken with vegetables, and ate slowly, savoring the familiarity of the meal, yet conscious of the emptiness beside me. The house was still, too still. The usual chatter, laughter, and footsteps of family members were absent, leaving only the echo of memories and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Over the next few days, I began noticing patterns I had ignored in the past. Invitations that never arrived, phone calls that went unreturned, casual comments dropped in conversation that implied my presence was not expected or required. I documented each incident in my journal, noting the date, the people involved, and my emotional response, not as a way to harbor bitterness, but to understand the shifting dynamics with clarity. By midweek, the absence of contact was no longer subtle. It had become undeniable. The loneliness settled into the corners of my home, pressing quietly against the walls and furniture, shaping the rhythm of my days. I took walks around the neighborhood, exchanged greetings with neighbors, and engaged in small talk to fill the quiet. Yet the sensation of exclusion remained a persistent undertone. At night, I sat by the window looking out at the darkened streets, reflecting on the moments that had led to this distance and the ways in which relationships could transform unexpectedly. I realized that this was not merely about missing a dinner or a phone call. It was a shift in the subtle architecture of trust and attention that had defined my family interactions for decades. In that contemplation, I resolved to observe patiently, to note actions more than words, to pay attention to the unspoken messages that revealed intentions and priorities. It became clear that understanding the full scope of the change required me to remain vigilant, to continue documenting patterns, and to preserve my sense of self even as the landscape of family connection evolved before my eyes, a delicate balance of perception, reflection, and measured response that would guide the days to come. That evening, I decided to take a quiet walk through the neighborhood, the autumn air crisp against my cheeks, leaves crunching softly beneath my shoes, a rhythm that felt oddly comforting. Margaret Sullivan, 69, moved slowly, taking in the familiar sights of the street where Richard and I had spent so many years together, noting the lights in neighbors' windows, the glow from the diner at the corner, all while carrying the invisible weight of exclusion. I thought about the photographs Emily had shared, her innocent smile a stark contrast to the subtle sting of realization that I was being left out. Back home, the house was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls as the lamps cast soft golden hues over the furniture. I placed the kettle on the stove, listening to the gentle whistle as steam rose, thinking about how ordinary tasks had become anchors in a day otherwise filled with unspoken tension. A knock at the door made me pause, hope sparking briefly, only to find it was a delivery left unattended, the cheerful driver unaware of the storm brewing quietly inside. I set the package aside and moved to the living room, arranging a few photographs, noting the spaces where I had once expected smiles and conversation, now filled with silence. The phone remained eerily still, no messages, no missed calls. I realized then that the small exclusions, the unspoken omissions, were beginning to define the contours of my new reality. I poured myself a cup of tea, savoring the warmth and familiarity, a small rebellion against the isolation. In the next room, the television played softly, background noise to the thoughts racing through my mind. The subtle ways my family had shifted, the unintentional cruelty masked by busy schedules and polite words, the distance that was growing like ivy along the walls. I sat in the armchair near the window, journal in hand, pen poised, recording each observation, each quiet interaction, noting patterns, gestures, and phrasing that revealed more than outright statements ever could. There was no confrontation, no loud accusations, only a series of tiny moments that collectively spoke volumes. I reflected on the promises made at the funeral, the hug from Michael, the whispered assurances of support, realizing that words alone could not guarantee presence. This understanding brought a new clarity. My role was no longer passive. Observing, recording, and responding thoughtfully would become the quiet power I wielded to navigate this shifting family landscape. The night deepened, and the house, though silent, became a canvas for reflection, strategy, and inner fortitude, each corner a witness to the beginnings of independence and self-preservation in a family that was learning, slowly, that I could exist fully without waiting for their acknowledgement. The turning point arrived on a quiet Wednesday evening. I had spent most of the day cleaning out a closet upstairs, sorting through boxes that Richard and I had not touched in years. There were old holiday decorations, photo albums, and handwritten notes tucked into drawers. The work was exhausting but comforting. Every item carried a memory. Every memory reminded me that my life had been full long before this season of loneliness began. As the sun started to set, my phone finally rang. It was Michael. I answered immediately, trying not to sound too eager. We spoke for a few minutes about ordinary things. The weather, his work, Emily's upcoming school activities. Then he mentioned a family dinner planned for the weekend. For a brief moment, I felt relieved. Perhaps things were changing. Perhaps the distance I had been feeling was beginning to close. Then he added a sentence that stayed with me long after the call ended. "We thought you might prefer to rest this weekend," he said casually. "You have been through a lot lately." I sat quietly in my kitchen. "So I am not invited?" I asked gently. There was a pause. Not a long pause. Just long enough. "We just figured you might want some space." Space. It was becoming everyone's favorite word. Space after the funeral. Space after the holidays. Space after family gatherings. The more I heard it, the more I realized it was not space they were giving me. It was distance. After we ended the call, I remained seated at the kitchen table. The house felt unusually still. Outside, the neighborhood carried on as normal. Cars passed. Dogs barked in the distance. A lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically somewhere down the street. Yet inside my home, I felt the weight of a realization I could no longer ignore. My family was making decisions about my involvement without asking me what I wanted. They were assuming, deciding, managing, all while convincing themselves they were helping. Later that evening, I opened my journal and reviewed the entries from the previous several weeks. The pattern became impossible to dismiss. Invitations had slowly disappeared. Phone calls had become less frequent. Important family moments happened without me. Every incident on its own seemed harmless. Together, they formed a picture I could no longer deny. I thought back to the day of Richard's funeral. Michael's arms around my shoulders. His promise that we would face everything together. I believed him then. I truly did. Perhaps he believed it too. But intentions and actions are rarely the same thing. As I turned another page in my journal, something unexpected happened. Instead of sadness, I felt clarity. The disappointment remained, but beneath it was something stronger. Understanding. I could not control how often people called. I could not control invitations or decisions made in other households. What I could control was how much power I allowed those choices to have over my happiness. For weeks, I had been waiting for someone to pull me back into the center of the family. That night, for the first time, I considered a different possibility. Maybe I needed to stop waiting. Maybe the life ahead of me was not about returning to what once existed. Maybe it was about building something new. As darkness settled outside the windows, I closed the journal and looked around the room. The photographs on the mantel had not changed. The memories had not changed. But something inside me had. The loneliness was still there. Yet alongside it stood a quiet determination. And for the first time since Richard died, that determination felt stronger than the silence. Over the next few days, I found myself observing the quiet patterns in my home, noticing the small omissions that had begun to accumulate into a discernible distance. Margaret Sullivan, 69, widow, moved through the rooms of her house with an acute awareness of each sound, each shadow, each subtle movement that might signal attention or neglect from my family. The mornings began with light filtering through the curtains, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air, and I would make my way to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, each step deliberate, each movement a meditation on the continuity of daily life in the absence of overt familial connection. Michael and Jennifer were busy with work, errands, and Emily's school activities, their absence increasingly punctuated by polite but distant messages. I began to catalog these interactions, noting patterns of engagement, times of absence, and the emotional undertones of their words and gestures. One afternoon, I overheard Jennifer speaking to a friend on the phone, her voice measured, light, and conversational, discussing plans for a family outing without mentioning me. The realization settled quietly in my mind. Decisions were being made that directly impacted me without any consultation, a subtle form of exclusion that required careful navigation. Instead of reacting impulsively, I chose observation, reflection, and quiet strategic patience. I focused on maintaining my routines, tending to the garden, reading, and writing in my journal, capturing each nuance of my environment and interactions. Evening walks became a space for contemplation, each neighborhood street offering perspective on the shifting dynamics of attention and presence. I found solace in the familiarity of my surroundings, in the continuity of small rituals, and in the recognition that my awareness and calm approach were forms of control, the foundation for navigating a family whose priorities had subtly shifted. As I sat by the window one night, the house enveloped in the soft glow of lamps, I realized that power did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it resided in quiet attention, in meticulous observation, and in the decision to engage on one's own terms. The days continued, marked by subtle cues, the slow unfolding of choices made without me, yet each moment provided insight, clarity, and the gradual construction of inner strength. In this process, I recognized the emergence of a new rhythm, one that allowed me to reclaim agency in a world that had begun to exclude me, and to understand that independence, dignity, and calm perseverance were more potent than any protest or confrontation could ever be. By the following week, Margaret Sullivan noticed subtle shifts in interactions that confirmed her observations from previous days. Michael's visits had become sporadic, often interrupted by phone calls or tasks, and Jennifer's presence was more perfunctory than warm, her politeness a thin veneer over growing distance. Emily still tried to engage but hesitated, sensing the tension that Margaret had quietly cataloged. Each morning began with a deliberate routine, preparing breakfast, watering indoor plants, and walking the familiar halls of her home, noting details that might signal attention or neglect. She spent time reviewing photographs of family gatherings, observing patterns of inclusion and omission, and reflecting on the slow construction of emotional barriers. In the afternoons, she walked the neighborhood streets, greeting neighbors and exchanging small talk that filled the silence with gentle rhythm, while mentally mapping her family's shifting priorities. Margaret realized that absence was not merely physical but emotional, communicated through gestures, choice of words, and the unspoken decisions that excluded her. She began to treat each interaction with careful attention, noting subtleties in tone, eye contact, and body language that revealed unspoken intentions. A message from Michael arrived one evening, brief and practical, discussing mundane plans without mention of shared time or concern. Margaret read it and set it aside, absorbing the nuances of what was said and what was left unsaid. In this space, she cultivated patience and insight, recognizing that understanding the full scope of familial behavior required observation without reaction, and that strength was in measured engagement rather than impulsive confrontation. She maintained her home meticulously, arranged flowers in the living room to brighten the space, and kept her journals up to date with careful reflections, each entry documenting the subtleties of exclusion and the faint traces of attention that occasionally surfaced. The evenings were quiet, the house filled with soft lamplight and the occasional hum of passing traffic, providing the perfect environment for reflection and mental mapping. Margaret began planning activities for herself, small outings, and personal projects that cultivated independence while remaining available for meaningful interaction when it occurred naturally. She understood that her family's distance was not permanent nor absolute, but a window into their priorities and attentiveness, which required interpretation and gentle navigation. By focusing on her routines, her observations, and her inner clarity, she strengthened her sense of self, turning moments of absence into opportunities for strategic awareness and emotional resilience. Each day became a careful study in human behavior, a testament to quiet endurance, and a rehearsal for engagement that honored both her dignity and her understanding of the subtle, intricate dynamics of her family's evolving relationships. Something unexpected happened as autumn slowly gave way to winter. The more I stopped waiting for invitations, the more space I created for my own life. For months, my attention had been focused on what was missing. The phone calls that never came, the dinners I was not invited to attend, the conversations that happened without me. Now, for the first time since Richard passed away, I began focusing on what was still possible. One Tuesday morning, I signed up for a community book club at the local library. I almost changed my mind before walking through the door. Richard had always been the social one. He could start conversations with anyone. I was quieter, more reserved, yet something inside me pushed forward. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it ended, I realized I had laughed more than I had in weeks. The following Saturday, I joined a gardening group that met twice a month. Soon my calendar contained activities that had nothing to do with waiting for my family to remember I existed. My days began to feel fuller, more meaningful. The loneliness had not disappeared completely, but it no longer controlled every room in the house. One afternoon, I was arranging flowers in the dining room when my phone rang. It was Michael. We exchanged greetings, and after a few minutes, he asked what I had been doing lately. There was genuine curiosity in his voice. When I mentioned the book club and gardening group, he sounded surprised. "You have been busy," he said. "I guess I have," I replied with a smile. After we ended the call, I realized something important. For the first time in months, our conversation had not revolved around my grief. It had not revolved around what I had lost. It had focused on what I was building. A few days later, Emily stopped by unexpectedly after school. She sat at my kitchen table eating homemade cookies while telling me stories about her classes and friends. The visit felt natural, comfortable, unforced. At one point, she glanced around the room and said, "Grandma, you seem happier lately." The comment caught me off guard. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "I think I am learning how to move forward," I said softly. She nodded as though she understood more than I expected. After she left, I sat quietly by the window watching snowflakes drift through the afternoon air. Emily's words stayed with me. Happier. I was not sure I would have chosen that word. Stronger, perhaps. More peaceful. More certain. But maybe happiness begins with those things. Over the following weeks, another subtle shift occurred. The family members who had once seemed distant started reaching out more often. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Small messages appeared. occasional phone calls, questions about my activities, interest in my plans. I found the change fascinating. When I had been sitting alone waiting for attention, very little came. Now that I had stopped waiting, people seemed to notice. Human nature can be strange that way. The less desperately we seek validation, the more confidently we carry ourselves. One evening, as I placed another completed journal on the bookshelf beside the others, I realized how much had changed since the funeral. I was no longer measuring my worth through invitations or phone calls. I was building a life that belonged to me. And somewhere along the way, the people who had slowly drifted away were beginning to notice the difference. As winter gave way to the first hints of spring, Margaret Sullivan began to sense a deeper shift within both herself and the rhythms of her family. The quiet persistence of her own routines, the morning tea by the window, tending to potted plants, journaling reflections on each subtle interaction, had transformed the texture of her days from one of anticipation to one of purpose. She noticed that Michael's check-ins had become more conversational, asking about her activities with genuine curiosity rather than perfunctory politeness. Jennifer's occasional visits were now accompanied by thoughtful questions about the projects Margaret had taken on, from neighborhood volunteering to creative writing exercises she had begun for her own enjoyment. Emily continued to share her youthful stories and achievements, and this time, Margaret engaged with delight and patience, fully present without expectation of reciprocation beyond the joy of connection itself. One afternoon, while arranging flowers in the sunlit kitchen, Margaret reflected on the months since her loss. She realized that her independence had reshaped not only her own sense of self, but also the dynamics of her family. Rather than being pulled into forced attention, they were slowly noticing her presence, her calm strength, and the space she had carved for her own life. There was no dramatic confrontation, no sudden reconciliation, only a gradual recognition born of consistent presence and quiet dignity. Each small interaction, Michael sharing a new recipe, Jennifer bringing a cup of tea while discussing weekend plans, Emily sitting nearby with sketches from school, felt authentic and unhurried, a natural unfolding of attention rather than a manufactured effort. The garden outside glowed with early spring blooms, and Margaret took a slow walk along the stone path, observing the colors, the sunlight filtering through budding leaves, and the soft sound of birds returning after winter. She thought about the journey she had undertaken, from quiet exclusion and observation to proactive engagement and personal growth. Her awareness of family dynamics allowed her to navigate interactions without anxiety, balancing warmth with discernment. As the day drew to a close, she returned inside, placing the journal on the side table and sitting near the window to watch the sky change from bright blue to soft orange and pink hues. In this serene moment, she understood the subtle truth. Control over one's own life and happiness does not depend on the attention of others, but on the intentional cultivation of one's daily actions, interests, and self-respect. Margaret smiled softly, feeling the fullness of her agency, the richness of her chosen routines, and the emerging genuine connections that now existed on terms she had quietly established. The family, no longer inadvertently excluding her, had begun to engage in a rhythm that respected her independence, and she felt a deep, steady peace, a quiet triumph that was built on patience, observation, and the steady nurturing of her own life.